one of the worst economic times in American history. Now, if you want a great argument, just ask a historian or economic historian or an economist what caused the Great Depression, and nobody will agree. You can have great debates, knockdown dragouts over the Great Depression, but it was a time of high unemployment, bank failures, people walking the streets of the United States, people displaced from their jobs, both in urban areas and rural areas. The Great Depression left a mark on people's lives and has left a mark on U.S. history. The president when the Great Depression began was Herbert Hoover. Uh, Born in Iowa, he attended Stanford University, became an engineer, spent most of his time in Australia um, as an engineer on gold mines, where he invested very well and made money from the gold mines. During World War I, Herbert Hoover was asked by Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat president, to head the U.S. Food Administration. And after the war, he helped to feed the Belgians from a crisis in Belgium. Calvin Coolidge named him as Secretary of Commerce, where he ran the Commerce Department as a populist and became very popular in that job from the different efforts that he led. He led a relief effort during the Mississippi floods of 1927 that made him very popular. And during World War II, or after World War II, he will help to feed Europe. But amazingly, he is considered a insensitive man who allowed people to starve to death and go without jobs in America. And when he ran for election in 1928, he ran against Democrat Al Smith, who was the first Catholic to ever run for president. And that was used against Al Smith in that election of being a Catholic. Hoover promised prosperity. Not everybody had benefited from the prosperity of the 1920s. There were many pockets of America, the farms, Appalachia, and other areas that had not benefited from the prosperity. The ghettos of the North, the African Americans, the barrios of the Hispanics in the West. But Hoover promised prosperity. The Republicans promised prosperity in the 1928 election. And despite their promises of prosperity, Hoover's going to serve 4 years of complete economic disaster. What caused the Great Depression? Well, I can tell you that the stock market crash of October of 1929, Black Tuesday, did not cause the Great Depression. That was sort of the lighting the candles on the cake, and there is a great debate over it. But there is one thing that is not a cause if you look through this list, and that is the economic policies of Herbert Hoover. Harry Truman, who appointed Hoover to feed Europe after World War II and to help in aiding the feeding of the starving people after World War II in Europe, made a statement. He said that Hoover did not create the Great Depression. The Great Depression was created for him. And that is very much true. Overproduction of consumer items, especially the automobile. The 1920s for consumer items was absolutely wonderful. Production was up. Well, everybody has this idea that production will always, you can always sell what you produce, that the economy will always be hot. There'll always be a bull market. Well, sooner or later they reach a saturation point, and by the end of the 1920s, that saturation point had come, where you had more consumer items and not enough demand. So that was one problem. There's income gap. Wages did not rise with the economy, and therefore buying power of the consumer was not what it should have been to keep up with the overproduction. Another thing was easy credit. You could buy everything on credit. It was just too easy during this period of time. The farm debt was very high. Farmers were in a depression throughout the United States, and farm debt was very high. Then you had the international debt caused by World War I, where countries owed money to the United States that banks had loaned money to France and Britain. And France and Britain were hoping for the reparations from Germany to be able to pay off the banks. Well, Germany couldn't pay the reparations, and they defaulted on the reparations, and therefore Britain and France defaulted on their paying their loans to the banks of the United States. And there were all kind of ways of trying to fix the problem, and none of those actually worked. And what eventually happened is this international debt problem leads to a one of the largest banks in Austria to go under. And the Great Depression was not just a United States economic problem, it was a worldwide problem. Then you have bank failures run on the banks, and the Federal Reserve, which had been created to help end bank failures, didn't do their job. And banks in those days, if you had a run on a bank, if you didn't get your money out and the bank ran out of money from everybody else, then you lost your money. The bank closed and you lost your money. And many people after the Great Depression did not trust banks because of so many people lost their money in bank runs. Then you had stocks overvalued. People could buy on a margin. They could borrow money from the bank, and then the bank were in the investment business also. And so you could borrow money and invest in the stock market. And everybody thought that it was a get rich quick in the stock market. That it was too easy. You could borrow money and put it in. And it became like going to Vegas and gambling, like putting your money on a roulette table. And you even had some dummy companies. Companies were just created that didn't exist. People were investing money in companies that didn't even exist, that could never were going to pay back any dividends or pay back any money or whatsoever. And the stock market works on a supply and demand. When there is a great supply of stock and the demand, the prices will go up. And when the demand for that particular company's stock goes down, then the price will go down. And what happened was all these factors together, people started selling their stock off in the fall of 1929. And by October, stock market crashed. But it's still going to be a year before the Great Depression truly kicks in. in the United States. At the height of the Great Depression, you had 1 out of every 4 uh, people unemployed, 25% unemployment. 1 out of every 3 factory workers by 1932. Now on the farm, they were displaced from their farms, the owners and laborers alike. Many owners would lose their farms because of the loans that they had made during the 1920s. Sharecroppers would lose their jobs. Tenant farmers would lose their job. Laborers on farms would lose. And the great scene were these migrant vagabonds. People loaded up in their trucks if they had one, or cars and everything they had in it, just driving the roads, looking for a job, looking for just something to eat, or people just walking the roads. You ask many people who lived during the Depression, what do you remember, and just the number of people just walking the roads with no jobs and nowhere to go. These people would settle in the woods somewhere where anyone would let them, and they would build little shanties of plywood towns, or as you see in this picture, just people living out under the trees in their beds. These little shanty towns in the rural areas were called Hoovervilles, named after the president. Many in the Midwest, farmers would migrate to California, and they were called Okies. Now, not all of them were from Oklahoma, but they were still called Okies. Grapes of Wrath is an excellent book that talks about the Okies, the displaced Midwesterners going to California. And there were other things named after Hoover during this time. The Hoover buggy was a car pulled by a horse, and you had, as my mom called it, Hoover gravy, and greasy water, all that people had to eat. In the urban areas, many people just slept on the streets, or slept in an alley somewhere. And you had these great lines like you see here, um, either lines just looking for a job, bread lines, soup lines. Many people turned to selling pencils on the street or apples on the street, just to make a little bit of money, where they could have something to eat, or in the urban areas. For the minorities, African Americans lost their low paying jobs in the urban areas to the whites. And the farmers, African American farmers, about 400,000 of them moved north to the cities, only to find more poverty and um, very few jobs in the cities. In the Hispanics, many of them lost their houses and left the barrios, lost their low paying jobs, and they become migrant farm workers. Um, and those that did live in the rural areas migrated to the cities to just find more poverty. Asian Americans, Japanese and Chinese alike, many of them very highly educated, could not even find a job. They either worked in their mom, dad's little store, or they worked on the streets, and many of them, went to migrant working. You had people with bachelor's degrees and master's degrees um, uh, picking grapes or cutting lettuce in California. This gives you some of the idea of the life during the Great Depression. People in the long lines in the urban areas selling apples for 5 cents a piece on the street. A family in a Hooverville on the right corner. The one on the left is from the Dust Bowl, and we're going to talk about the next couple of slides about the Dust Bowl. It, the hard times were not enough with the economic depression, the collapse of the stock market, people without a job. Mother Nature piled on beginning in 1931. There had been um, years of drought on the Great Plains and out in the West. Um, they did not plant cover crops, and so um, the erosion, the wind storms created these dust storms. The worst was April 14th, 1935, which was Black Sunday. I have a picture on the next slide to show just how bad Black Sunday was. 100 million acres of topsoil was lost. Some 2.5 million people left the Great Plains. Remember, they're Okies, but not all of them from Oklahoma, from Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, all moved to California. And this is again depicted in John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Today there's what's called soil conservation. You cannot leave land just barren like this. You have to plant cover crops on it. If you're not going to plant it year after year, you still have to put a cover crop on it today. Now, this is a picture of Black Sunday out in Oklahoma, how bad the dust storm was. One of the myths that you hear many times about Herbert Hoover and the Great Depression is he didn't do anything to help the hurting. Some people argue that the reason there was depression went so long was that Herbert Hoover actually did something or tried to fix the Great Depression. It is a myth, though, that he did nothing. He tried to do something about the misery, but Nobody had ever been presented with this widespread depression before. We'd had panics and depressions, but not of the caliber of the depression that started in 1929 and reached its peak in 1932. Hoover asked the charities to help the unemployed, to increase their help. Salvation Army and Catholic Relief and others. Problem was, it just wasn't enough money to make a difference. The charities have to get their money from donations, and then usually when you have depressions, the donations to charities go down, and so there just wasn't enough money. Hoover called in Alfred P. Sloan of General Motors and Henry Ford and other top industrialists and asked them to please freeze wages and layoffs. Don't lay off people and don't lower the wages. Henry Ford even increased his wages, but this was during a time when they were not selling any automobiles. They were not selling any product. This is money coming out of Henry Ford's pocket, out of his bank account. Hoover, even when he was first elected, decided to reverse the policies of Calvin Coolidge, and he had the Agricultural Marketing Act passed, which was to buy up the surplus commodities. This again was an idea, if you remember, was a populist idea all the way back to the People's Party of the farmers. Hopefully by buying surplus commodities it would keep farm prices up. But a protective tariff was also passed as a part of it, and this hurt farmers because when you pass a tariff to put a tax on a foreign country is going to put a tax on you. And so instead of increasing farm marketing overseas, actually American farmers sold less overseas. There was less demand, which means that drove the farm prices even lower. So the Agricultural Marketing Act, although a great idea and Hoover trying to help the farmers, it failed. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation put about $1.5 billion in trying to save banks and insurance and railroads, and also into public works. Remember this idea from Jacob Coxey? Create public jobs with printed money. Well, basically that's what this is. It failed to achieve its goals because it only really helped the large companies. That means the smaller companies still went bankrupt, went out of business. And there was not really enough money spent to prime the pump of restarting and having an effect on stimulating the economy back to where it was before 1932. Now, to add insult to injury, we have a tariff passed by or supported by these two gentlemen in Congress, Hawley and Smoot, or Smoot and Hawley. I've seen it actually listed both ways in different textbooks, so either way. Raised tariffs on 20,000 products from 50% to 100% tax. That means if something had cost $5 coming over here now, it cost $10. That's 100% tax. Well, when you put that much tariff on a foreign country, that hurts foreign countries from selling in the United States. And they're going to retaliate by putting a tariff on American goods. So By the end of 1931, imports went down 61% and exports went down 66%. So instead of helping the American industry, it actually hurt American industry. And unemployment then is going to rise because business volunteerism is over with. Henry Ford can't pay that extra salary anymore. He cannot, him and Alfred P. Sloan at General Motors cannot keep their promise to Hoover about not laying off people and not cutting wages. And so the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was supposed to help, actually hurt. The veterans wanted a bonus that had been promised to them in to be paid in 1945, $1,000, which today is about $14,400. They wanted their pay early. So in 1932, some 6,000 of them decided to march on Washington to ask for an early payment of their bonuses. The bill to pay them early was called the Patman Bill, named after Wright Patman, congressman. It passed the House, where the Democrats were in a majority. The Democrats had taken control in 1931 of the House. And so it passed the House. It failed in the Senate, where the Republicans still had a slight majority in the Senate. So it never reached Herbert Hoover's desk. After the Senate failed to pass the Wright-Patman bill to give them their bonuses early, the protesters, many of them stayed in D.C. Some of them went home. And many of them began to occupy buildings in the District of Columbia. The president asked for them to be removed, and the police began to remove them. Well, they began to throw rocks at the police. The police shot back, and 2 protesters were shot dead. Hoover called for the military to clear D.C. and General Douglas MacArthur came out to clear them with tanks, machine guns, tear gas, and MacArthur went beyond his orders to clear D.C. Used extreme force. There's statistics on the 100 protesters injured, exactly how they were injured, from sword cuts to tear gas, burns. But he pushed the protesters out. MacArthur pushed them out of D.C. across the Anacostia River where they had built a shanty town, or Hooverville, and he set it on fire. This was the day and time of the newsreel at the theater. You went to the theater, you could go for a nickel, and people would save up enough money, even in the Depression, just to go to the movies. It was one way to get away from the misery, was going to see a movie. You not only got a movie, you got a cartoon, there was a serial, and there was the news in pictures. Every major studio had their own news, Fox and MGM and Warner Brothers, and they would show the news. And so for the first time, people could see events throughout the United States or the world on motion pictures with sound. And so people went to the theater in 1932 and they saw pictures of the shantytown being burned down outside of D.C. and you see the Capitol building in the background of this picture. And the popularity of Herbert Hoover went even lower. He was seen as insensitive. He was blamed for all this, even though he didn't have anything to do with the Wright-Patman bill. It did not pass for him to either get a chance to sign it or veto it. He was not directly responsible for what Douglas MacArthur's actions. He asked for the removal of the people from D.C., but he never authorized the force that was used. He was considered to blame, and that he was insensitive. He didn't care about the hurting masses, even though he had tried programs that no one had ever tried before to help the people that were hurt by the Depression. And this really truly, after the Bonus March, becomes Hoover's Depression. Franklin Roosevelt saw this newsreel at his own house in Hyde Park, and Franklin Roosevelt said, 32 being a presidential election year, "I've just been elected president of the United States." Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been born in Hyde Park, New York. He was a cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He married a third cousin, Eleanor. And during the Wilson administration, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. In 1920, he was on the Democrat ticket with James Cox as Cox's vice president nominee, and they lost that election to Harding and Coolidge. In 1921, Franklin Delano Roosevelt diagnosed with polio, and polio left him paralyzed from his waist down. He had these braces, big iron braces that he used to wear, and he used crutches to try to help him stand. And in private he used wheelchair. When you see FDR standing, he is locked in those braces. He never wanted anyone to see him in a wheelchair. He never wanted to see anyone to see him look like that he was incapable of doing what a normal person could do. You will see Roosevelt driving automobile. Automobile companies made cars where he could operate the brake and the accelerator with his hands because he could not use his feet. In 1930, he was elected governor of New York. So in 1931, he was sworn in as governor of New York. And he had tried to help give some relief to the state of New York with different programs. And then he decided to run against, or run for president in 1932, and he got the Democratic nomination. And in his acceptance speech at the Democrat National Convention, he talked about a New Deal. He never really outlined what he thought was, or anything about the New Deal. And during the campaign, when he's asked about it, he'd just give general statements about it. He never really got specific about what the New Deal was. He criticized Hoover over deficit spending. Hoover had created a large debt. But because of the Depression, Hoover loses to Roosevelt in a landslide, and the Democrats take control of the Congress, a pretty large majority of the House and the Senate. Right, this gives you an idea of the landslide victory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 32. All the blue is Roosevelt, and the red, what little there is on this map, is Hoover. After the election in November of 1932, there was this interregnum period before Roosevelt was sworn in. Now, presidents were not sworn in until March 4th. This goes all the way back to George Washington's second term. In those early days of American history, it took time between the election, the Electoral College meeting in December, Congress approving of the electoral vote. There was no telegraph, there was no telephone. Transportation was poor in America. So it took time to get word out that the president had been elected and get the person to D.C. for an inauguration. Well, by 1930s, those obstacles are gone. You have telegraph, you have telephone, quick communication, you have train, you have even airplane transportation now by the 1930s. And so there was this idea that maybe we need to shorten the time between election and inauguration. And the problem was the Depression became even worse after the election. It just seemed like that, Hoover could do nothing right. And he asked Roosevelt for some support, and Roosevelt refused to make any promises or pledges of what he was going to do. And Banks' failures accelerated in February, a month before the inauguration. So after the inauguration of Roosevelt, he would be the last to ever be sworn in on March the 4th. We have the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, which is called the Lame Duck Amendment. A politician who is in office and loses the election in November, or is retiring after November, is considered a lame duck, since they will be leaving office the next year. So now we inaugurate our president on January the 20th. The Congress, the new Congress, convenes on January the 3rd, is the first day of Congress every year.